I appreciate everybody taking the Saturday out to spend time and discuss the workshop today. And today's topic is the game within the game. And I'd like to first start off by thanking Christina Vasari and also my good friend Bob Nider who's been very instrumental in my development over the years. And I was thinking about the topic today for a variety of reasons. Certainly during this COVID-19, I was thinking about how players prepare themselves for the game. And during this time, I know that a lot of guys don't have the opportunity to utilize practice facilities and also, all of the things that are associated with performance. And I really hope that there are individuals that are contemplating starting in fall or anytime soon, that they consider this discussion as part of their repertoire and tools towards success. So for the past 25 years, I've spent a great deal of my time working with professional athletes and collegiate athletes, primarily around behavioral concerns, conduct problems, as well as performance. And so I've had the pleasure of working, the privilege and pleasure of working with the National Football League and the NBA and colleges around such matters. And one of the things that I've noticed continuously or consistently over time is that there's so much emphasis placed around performance, and that is a behavior that is certainly reinforced, but little attention is paid to what happens once you enter the doors. In other words, what happens when you enter within an organization. And so therefore, I began to think about those individuals that I had opportunity to work with that were extremely successful, not only on the field, but off the field, but more importantly, those individuals that have been able to sustain their careers, particularly in professional sport. So we're talking about individuals like Antonio Gates, Larry Fitzgerald. These are individuals that have been with one organization, and they've been with one organization over time. And that is striking to me, particularly given all of the changes that occur within an organization. So as I begin this discussion, I really like for everyone to think about what it's like to enter someone's house, for example. And this is a conversation that I actually have with players, because a lot of times they simply just do not understand that they have to make the transition into someone else's house, literally. And so when we think about entering someone's house, what does that really mean? What does that really require? What does that really mean that an individual have to do with respect to being successful? Well, certainly you have to understand the rules, right? And you have to understand what the expectations are. And so what I want us to do is to think about walking into someone's house, just as you walk into your home, and just thinking even about your own experiences moving forward as a young person. So when you think about the National Football League, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about this being not for long. But the reality is that football has been around, pro football has been around 100 years, the NBA has been around 73 years, and the NCAA has been around for 114 years. So as an athlete, as a coach, or even as a parent, if there's parents online, we have to first understand that we are entering someone else's house. And each house, including our own, are governed by policies, regulations, expectations. And in this specific case, or in these specific three cases, these are operations that have been long successful businesses. And I think a lot of athletes have some idea of what a business is like, but not really. I want to run, I hear players, I'm going to start my own business, but they don't really understand what that means. And one of the things that I try to do is to help concretize what a business is like by having people to do an inventory of themselves and what are some of the expectations they have if they had their own business. you know, and a business can be many things to many different people, but clearly these are businesses that are predicated on not only one's performance, but on the generation of money. And so I say that, and that's not to be provocative, but is to, you know, present the reality for those that are considering a future in professional sport. And even again, for those individuals that are thinking about college or in college, there are certain things, there are certain guidelines that individuals need to completely understand in order to be successful. So I'd like to talk to you about a couple of things as it relates to that. And I think the most important thing with this conversation or anything that I'll talk to you about today starts with you. Okay, it really does start with you looking at yourself, looking at your own vulnerabilities, looking at what you're predisposed to, looking at what your earlier experiences were like, looking at what's your tendency to react to change, your tendency to react to authority, your tendency to act to structures, and how flexible are you and how willing are you to challenge yourself to understand what these differences are about. I frequently ask professional athletes, do you know the history of the league? And they'll say, well, why are you asking me that? And I'll say, well, have you ever thought about who played, for example, your position? Who were the precursors to your position? And some guys are able to articulate that, but most aren't. And it's kind of unfortunate because I think that there's so much emphasis around performance and now, and that's so reinforced that players don't really begin to look outside of themselves in relationship to things that are going to affect their careers. One of the things I'd like to say, and I didn't mention this earlier, if anyone has any questions as we're moving forward, please feel free, but we certainly will allow time at the end of this conversation for you to post questions or concerns that you might have relative to your own experience. So one of the most important things that a player should understand is the culture of the organization that he or she are about to enter, or not only enter, but also to understand what does this represent. I happened to go to the University of Michigan as undergraduate, and football was really, really big there. In fact, football permeated the entire culture. And so what is culture? What does culture mean? I mean, it's really how we perform. I mean, it's really how we exist. It is the expectations, both spoken and unspoken, that we live by. It guides what we do, how we do what we do, when we do what we do. But it's a very important part of the experience. And it's not one that we often talk about, but we're expected to respond to. And that goes for coaches, that goes for team personnel as well. And one of the things that is very important is to, I think as a player, and certainly anybody working within an organization, is to understand that that culture permeates, is permeated, and well, it starts from the top and it permeates throughout the organization. So whether it's a an owner, a general manager, a coach, it doesn't matter. That is going to be something that you need to really understand and get a hold to. Again, this is in contrast to all of the messaging that we get as players around performance. And again, performance is important, but it doesn't determine, I believe, long-term success. So I'd like to show you a video. And in this video, it's going to, I think in some ways explain the interaction, one important interaction between a player and a coach. I'd like to get your input on that because I think this is also probably a continuation of the idea of culture and expectations. Give me a moment.
Hello, Rico.
What's up, Cap?
I'm glad I caught you. Hey, man, we need to get together. Are you at the crib? No, man, just about to go get a lift.
We really need to talk.
Well, what's up? What's up?
Man, it seems like you got some things on your mind, man. You're not focused on the field.
Well,
We need you on Sunday, man. It seems like you're preoccupied.
yeah, I got some stuff popping, but I got to focus up. I do. You're right.
You need to be there on Sunday. We need everybody on Sunday.
All right, man. I feel you.
So let me call you back a little later. We'll set up a time. I need to sit down and talk to you about a few things.
All right, man.
So I'd like to have anybody respond to the following questions. What do you think Rico did well? And where could he be improved? And how do you imagine this will impact their relationship in the future? So I'd like to hear from you, the participants.
Well, I feel like he was cordial and he was not aggressive with his communication.
When you say he, meaning the player, Rico?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I agree. What other things did you observe? Anyone else?
Rico is the player or the coach?
Rico is the player. The coach is the guy on the golf course.
Okay.
So the idea, Joshua, is that the coach wants him to focus, and there's a big game on Sunday, and he's telling Rico directly, "Hey, I need you to focus. I need you to get your game together so that we can do this." So, any thoughts about their exchange? What did Rico do well? Or what did, even for that matter, what did the coach do well?
I thought Rico admitted that, like, hey, I'm not focused. Yeah, I think, like he admitted there was a problem, and I thought the coach was kind of compassionate in working with him.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. Any other?
Yeah, I agree. That's what I was going to say, is that he openly admitted, says, yeah, I got stuff that's on my mind. And so he acknowledged what was going on, didn't deny it.
Okay, great. Absolutely. Is there any areas where he could have improved, do you think, Rico, the player in this case?
I think maybe Rico could have just stopped moving, like so that he could be more focused on the conversation with this coach.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
What if he acknowledged and opened up, says, hey, how about we get together at a certain time? Let's not wait till Sunday. Let's be proactive and let me tell you about what's going on.
Okay, so great. So I think, so how do you imagine this would affect their relationship in the future?
Things are left kind of open-ended and non-specific.
Okay. Well,
yeah, the coach, maybe it's not the appropriate time yet since they're on the phone. He was trying to set up a meeting, but he never really asked him more specifically what is bothering him.
mm-hmm.
So like the lady just said, it was left very open-ended.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if that was the time to get into more specifics or not, but it was still left very open-ended rather than ask him, hey, what has been bothering you? Maybe, and then get some feedback on more specifics, what's bothering him, and then set up an appointment time to follow up and get together and see if the coach can help him through that process.
No, it's an excellent.
Rather than just go to the outcome of what he wanted, which was we needed you on Sunday.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. And so to your point, Ben, is it Ben?
Yes.
Yeah, Ben, I appreciate that because there is a reciprocal responsibility with both the coach and the player. And so players do get confused and there is broken communication that occurs often and doesn't result in the outcome that one might desire. So there are a couple of things that I'd like to comment on. I think actually, and I agree with those that have made the comment, that he, Rico, the player, was calm. He responded non-defensively. However, there was a lot lost. And perhaps the coach, to Ben's point, chose not to go further than there because they were away from each other, but he certainly could have made that recommendation. The key point here that I think is really important that we haven't discussed, but it relates to the whole issue of the game within the game, is that coaches have a responsibility. They have a responsibility to adhere to all of the things that we talked about, the policy, the regulations, winning, and all of those things are in his responsibility bag, right? And so when players hear the coach, they don't always understand the context in which that is being requested. So sometimes you'll get a player who will be defensive because he doesn't understand the importance of that. And the other thing is that, and I think, Ben, you made this point, is that there may be some underlying issue that isn't addressed. And for the player, this is really important because the coach is not necessarily going to be as benevolent as you suggested, Ben. He's just may want to win. And certainly at the pro level, that's the bottom line. And they may or may not, depending on the relationship that he has with the player, ask him about what is going wrong. Because for him, the issue is about performance. Okay, that's the predominant issue. And so if you look closely at the coach, he seemed to be pretty uncomfortable. Even though he's asking the question, he seemed to have some anxiety about that, at least in terms of the way that he presented the information. And that anxiety is something that is internalized by the demand from that team. So if a team is losing, okay, or if the culture is such that it doesn't reward or doesn't embrace, going to see your therapist or your team clinician or whatever the case is, then that is going to be articulated on some level by that coach, and it's going to be received by that player. The point that I make here is that for players, most coaches, it's been my observation, they may care, but in the moment they are focused on the game. That is the bottom line. And this is where it's important for you to understand as players that are on this Zoom right now, that one has to understand context and one has to understand the relationship that a coach has to the organization, and that your relationship to that coach is very, very important. It's extremely important, but you also have a reciprocal responsibility. So I know I've said a lot, and I'm open to any questions about this because I could give you countless examples of how this plays out. Any other questions about that?
One thing that I was going to say was that, in many times the coach is seen as the coach, the mentor, the player, the mentee, and sometimes there may be an expectation that, well, you should know what's going on in my life. You see it. But as players, when something's going on, we've got to be able to be confident to reach out to that coach and say, look, I need to come to you. Don't wait for the coach to come and ask what's going on, because you're right. He has all these other demands going on. You as the player, you know what's going on in your life. And if you need help and you need support, it requires that initiative, taking and reaching out, whether it's going to be your coach or somebody else, you're reaching out to get you help and not continue to try to fight the quicksand.
That's all great. But in the real world, that's a lot of times that's not going to happen. The player at their age is not necessarily going to come forward to the coach and say, I've got a problem. The coach with a lot more life experience may notice things that are going on and have to go to the player first. So it can go either way, but it's a lot of times it's going to be the coach being observant of what's going on with the player.
Oh yeah, I
think the coach did pretty well, but the one concern I've got is the coach came across as a lot more interested in the player's production than in the player as a person. And I would have hit that first. The player as a person, I'm concerned about you, and you seem to be distracted, and get to that, and then bring in that, hey, yeah, we do need you on Sunday, but I want you to be good as a person too.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with both points. And again, this is one of the reasons why I provided this film, because it is, again, it's a reciprocal responsibility. And what is important for the coach to understand is that, to Ben's point, that these are young guys and that there may be threats about whether or not I get a chance to play, or concerns about whether or not, really where's the relationship with this coach and how far is it going to go? How is this going to impact me at a later time? But players need to realize players need to realize that they have a responsibility to utilize their resources. Okay, it's extremely important that players utilize their resources. But again, many players have not been taught to do that. And so creating an environment to create safety is very, very important. So that gets back to the whole issue of culture. But again, and the point that I made earlier, that it starts with you, is critically important. Starting with you, meaning starting with you as a coach, starting with you as a player, realizing what the resources are, and also realizing your own potential vulnerabilities and taking care of business to realize, and certainly at the pro level, you have a responsibility, and a coach may not be that caring if it's Sunday. That's the bottom line. And that's the reason why I mentioned to you guys earlier that when it's about money, when it's about business, there's not always going to be, the coach is not, that's not necessarily his role, even though I think that's the desired behavior. But when you're under the gun, coaches may or may not exhibit that behavior. And that's just the reality of it, based on my experience. So speaking of relationships, go back, please. Players also need to understand their relationships to other players. This is extremely important. Sometimes players just gravitate to players just based on where they grew up geographically and so forth. But I'm suggesting to players that they go beyond that they connect to players, as I mentioned Larry and I mentioned Gates, that they connect to players that have been successful, that they connect to players that they can confide in, as Ben just talked about, somewhere to go, some resource or some person to feel safe with. It's imperative that you establish relationships with players, in my opinion, that will be supportive, that understand the game, understand the nuances in the game, that can even teach you how to prepare for a game, but more importantly, to prepare for some of the unexpected parts of the game that can derail one's performance, such as conflicts with a coach, conflicts at home. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So I would like for everybody on the Zoom to think about their most important relationships, okay? And for players and for coaches or anyone else, generally those start with our parents. And for those that enter a league or college, you bring your parents with you. You bring your family with you. You bring your experiences with you. And so really understanding that dynamic is very, very important. I have found that players really have difficulty, particularly young players entering the league, the leagues, really don't know how to set boundaries. And it's understandable. If you come from an environment where there's little, there's going to be an expectation, whether it's spoken or unspoken, that you meet those. And I think this is one of the areas where players have the greatest challenge and difficulty, whether it's a 21-year-old or even a seasoned vet, is learning how to say no and learning how to set boundaries. And at the same time, recognizing an appreciation and showing appreciation for parents that have helped them to get there. So, one of the things that it's very difficult to tell a player, it's been very difficult for me, is to tell a player what to do in these circumstances. And one of the things that I really try to have them look at is a cost-benefit analysis of what it means to say no. And I think for those that are coaches on the phone, it's really important to realize that that if players aren't doing well, this might be an area where they're having difficulty. And for those that have coached and have parents that are over involved, I think you understand that this is an area where they may need your insight, support, and trust. But again, this is a very, very delicate area where the relationship is really contingent upon the time that you spend with that athlete because, you know, players, this is where a separation line exists, but it's certainly in the room, you know, it's certainly on the field, it's certainly on the court each time that you play. And I'd just like to just ask those that are coaches if they could share any situations in which they've had to work with players around this issue and what advice that they may have offered to their players. Ben, you're the only are you a coach?
Yeah, I am. I
No,
coach
okay.
high school tennis.
Oh, okay. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I've had it pretty lucky as far as setting boundaries part go. The biggest concern I have with some of them is just making that honest commitment on a consistent basis. But the kids that I've worked with over time, I really haven't had many issues with them not setting appropriate boundaries as far as school, as far as getting into things that they shouldn't be getting into away from the athletic field. So, you know, I haven't had much direct interaction with that. We just try and set like you use the word culture, which I think is great. Just try and set an environment that we're committed to each other, and we're committed to trying to bring out the best in each other so we can have the most success we can have and have a great journey, as I call it, a great journey along the way. And given that, I think if you aspire to lead your life that way, you're less likely to run into issues where you have to set boundaries. It is one interesting point, though, I will add. This is going back many years ago. I live in Columbia, Missouri, and I went out to the hotel where University of Kansas basketball was staying because I wanted to meet Bill Self.
Yeah.
And I did get a chance to meet him. I brought at the time, my young son, who was like 3 years old, so I figured that might be a drawing card. And Bill Self was a very nice guy. He came over and I talked to him. And one of the things he said, which I found interesting, and I'm interested to hear what you say about this, is he goes, kids really deep down inside want boundaries. And I've never forgotten that. And I'm just interested in your take on that. Do you, for the most part, agree with that statement that kids then, which was 12 years ago or so now, do they generally want boundaries or do they resist boundaries? What are your thoughts on that?
I think fundamentally all players want boundaries. They need boundaries. They know inherently that that's something that will help them to get to the next place. I think that many players, particularly players that have been highly touted or recognized, have more resistance sometimes because they were rewarded for their performance. And this again gets into the game within the game, realizing that they will have to adhere to boundaries in order to be successful. I think it's very important. It's incumbent upon coaches to do just what Self did and what you're suggesting, and that is to set boundaries. The kind of boundaries that I was referring to, though, however, is that many players don't know how to set boundaries, not only on themselves, but they certainly don't know how to set boundaries with significant people in their lives. And so those significant people in their lives can be, as I had a picture of a woman to depict a mother, but can extend with, beyond that. It could be friends and family, and that can really get in the way. And so when there's money involved, when there's, a lot of funds involved at the pro level, that becomes very, very difficult because family members, parents will say, well, we are going to do X. We are going to buy. We are going to, we are going to do these kinds of things. And so they become integrated into this system, this family system, which changes, so we have kids basically expected on some level to be parents. And so again, to your point, Ben, boundaries are very, very important because you get 21-year-old kids, 23-year-old kids that know nothing about boundaries or setting boundaries. And so they're all over the place. And in fact, I would even suggest many of the players that I have worked with that have gotten into trouble have difficulty not only setting boundaries for themselves, but because they feel the external permeation of their own boundaries or what they think should be appropriate, that they fall prey to using drugs or getting involved in problematic behavior because it's just too much. It's just too much energy. It's too hard to say no. So it's beyond the no. It's really about what, as you suggested, what they think and have learned to be right. So getting back to the earlier part of the conversation when I suggested that the businesses that operate and regulate where players play, they need to understand that there are boundaries and that this thread that you're talking about is part of that. So boundaries are very, very important.
Do you think it applies at the high school level too, that that level they're mature enough to want boundaries there too, or what are your thoughts?
I totally think that it is important to start in high school because that's the foundation for some of the problems that may exist later. But I think high school kids are really testing the boundaries in a whole lot of different ways in general, just in terms of finding themselves. And unfortunately, what you see is the continuation of that behavior if it's unaddressed by coaches or by parents themselves or by systems. And particularly when you see players, again, that are outstanding, that it does become a problem that results in them walking into the door or engaging in behavior that can be problematic, that gets them kicked out of the league, despite having a promising potential career.
Dr.
So by and
Martin?
large, you think that they do want boundaries then, even at the high school level? By and large, you think they deep down really want boundaries, even at the high school level? You think a lot of kids are just not mature enough and are resistant to them?
I would argue that I had two high school kids, and now they're in their 20s. Yeah, they want and need boundaries, and I think it really has to do a lot with how those boundaries are set and the sensitivity of the coach to understand different stages of development with individuals. So, for example, guys, young ladies, and particularly male players that are 17, 18 years old, they're individuating. They want to do their own thing. So they're going to test the boundaries a lot. And if those boundaries aren't set at home, you're going to be the receptacle of those issues. So there was another question. Thank you, Ben.
Right. Thank you.
Yep, sir. I was going to say, I really akin it to setting goals at the beginning of the season, whether it's a college or high school or pro level. We have a need to, or individuals, even in everyday life. And part of that is respect, like in all aspects of our daily being. And when I talk to youth, I definitely talk to them about being a leader in their community and someone for others to look up to, and setting the standard so that they reflect just that. And even to their parents, how do you want your parents to react to you? 17-year-old high school senior who's potentially getting a scholarship, to play basketball at your local junior college or, wherever, at whatever level it is. And goal setting, should be not just team oriented, but individualistic and behavioralistic. A lot of times, as you mentioned before, there's behavior concerns and performance concerns. And I definitely think that performance is intertwined and affected due to behavior or lack of structure within the behavior. And when a good coach would structure it to where that is a stepping stone to improve behavior day in, day out, academically, professionally, performance-wise, so that there is an overall team coherence.
No, I totally agree with you. And one could argue, and reasonably, I think, argue that you have to set boundaries on yourself and the coach or whomever is recommending a goal for a team or an individual, that's certainly a part of it. And so self-regulation is a very important part of achieving goals. And so I think that this gets back to you, Ben, again, with respect to setting limits and setting boundaries and knowing that without them, you can't achieve goals. I mean, if you do, it'll be hodgepodge, it'll be inconsistent, and you certainly won't meet success over a period of time. So I don't know, who just mentioned that?
JC.
JC, I appreciate what you said. And certainly it's important to think of goals as multifaceted. I mean, there's many elements to goals, as you know, and you just illustrated them. And so boundary setting is very, very important. So it doesn't matter what age it is. It's something that even players at the pro level need, and they get in trouble with it, and they're fined. But I would also tend to agree with both of you with respect to earlier that we begin this process, the easier it is for athletes. And again, the challenge, and I would challenge all of you, particularly with those players that are successful, that are talented and gifted, that we do this. Now, some players we know, and I mentioned Antonio Gates, and I mentioned Larry Fitzgerald. They're going to do it on their own. They did it on their own. It's something, you know, no one has to tell them to do that. But by and large, I think players need that, and that both of those guys, they got it from somewhere. And so that's the reason why they're successful as well. So I'd like to talk to you about the importance of those players that are media available, if you will, or certainly are part of the media. It's very, very important for players to understand, and this is certainly part of the game within the game at a higher level, certainly at the collegiate and pro level, to have a relationship with the media, to understand the importance of the media and to respect the media. I know someone mentioned respect before. And, you know, it's unfortunate, you know, the media has gotten a lot of negative press, and even players I know, and it bothers me personally when I see players that are interviewed kind of dismiss reporters. That's their job. That's part of the system. That's part of their responsibility. And in fact, I think players can be fined at the league level for not engaging in those discussions. So one of the things I think is important that maybe we can all take part in and to help to empower players to recognize is that the media is something that is designed to help them. And I'm not a media person or anything like that, but again, it gets back to what I said initially, it starts with them. And so your relationship is something that you have to take control over. Your relationship to your family, your relationship to your coaches, your relationship to the media, and developing that relationship can yield dividends for you for many, many years to come. So for those people that are players, those participants that are players on this Zoom, I want you to think of every interaction that you have as a potential to build a relationship. So it's like building a portfolio. And part of that portfolio involves your coach, involves your teammates, involves your family, involves your coaches, involves other key people that are part of this ecosystem. And, you know, I'll say this again with respect to players that might be on the phone, on the Zoom. You never want to have bad press, whether it's from the media itself, whether it's from a coach, because I've had countless coaches say to me, or countless people say to me, general managers, oh, he's a great guy. And then there'll be other guys and they'll just be very quiet. They'll be moved, basically. And that's their way of just saying, hey, look, I either like this guy, embrace this guy, he fits within our culture. He's not only a great player, but he's someone that I can depend on. And remember, again, as I may have mentioned about coaches, that it's your relationship is one that is a reciprocal one. And again, I want to just underscore that with anybody that you have an interaction with in sport. Any questions about that in relationship to media?
I kind of have a bit of a disagreement with you as far as, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but just a different viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about how players have to respect media, I get that. Like, you shouldn't start trash talking media or anything like that, but media also needs to respect the player. And there seems to be some situations where they're prying for every little thing, especially at the professional level. Like, when you look at more your middle school level and your high school level students, and you have your local news media, and they're giving them like athlete of the week awards and something like stuff like that, student athlete of the week and those sorts of things. That's acknowledging their success. But then when you go to the pro level, it's just overall media seems to have a problem with, you're there to interview the athlete for the story that's there, not to, with the story you have, try to create another one. So
Well,
the respect needs to be both ways.
I wouldn't disagree with you about the fact that, that's why I've been using the word reciprocal in all relationships. And I agree with you. I in fact, kind of shy away from interviews for that very reason, is because people can misconstrue what you said. They can take your word, or they can take an action and or your response and then paint a picture. The point that I make, and the point that is extremely important, again, when you think about it in the context of the game within the game, you, meaning the athlete, has to take charge of themselves in response to the world, in response to the media, in response to the coach. So specifically, if a media member is asking me something that I don't want to respond to, for example, let's say, and I have this next picture up here, there's a loss. Okay, this guy's walking out the field. The media is asking him, you blew this catch. It cost you the playoffs. Well, that player, and of course that's, depending on the way that the media person is requesting or talking to this player, can be very off-putting. And certainly the timing of that question is going to be very difficult for that person, the recipient, the player, to respond to favorably. But at the end of the day, that one picture, that one interaction can shape that person's potential career. I can give you countless examples of that, but I don't disagree with you that the media can be tough, the media can be unreasonable, the media can be a whole lot of things, but it is, at the end of the day, the responsibility of the player to comport himself or herself in such a way that it meets the player's need. So that's, I've had players come to me, for example, and say, hey man, I'm tired of them asking me these same questions. I'm tired of them asking me about this game. That was a year ago. I'm tired of this mess. And my question is, how do you choose to handle this? What is your goal? What is your responsibility? What are you paid to do? And so there are a lot of things that players don't like. And part of my job actually is to help players adjust to all of the things that you just suggested, not only with the media, but also their respective teams around policies, rules, guidelines. They don't make the rules, they just respond to them, and hopefully they respond in a favorable way. Any other thoughts about media? Or I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I did. What's that? Okay, I think that's just background noise. In this next slide, there's a gentleman walking off the field, and it serves both purposes, both the purpose of explaining what happens to players and learning how to comport themselves, as I illustrated a little bit earlier. So at this point, it's really important for players to know, again, that independent of what is going on with them, and I think Ben mentioned this earlier, whether the player is losing focus, whether the player is having a rough time, whether the player is having difficulty performing, that he or she has the responsibility for turning that around. And if they can't do it alone, that they certainly need to utilize their resources, the sports psychologists, the psychologists that are on the team, and any resources that they have to help them. The bottom line is that the game is up and down. I mean, you win some, you lose some, and as they say, it's how you play the game. But it's important for you as an individual to understand yourself in relationship to those things. So at the end of the day, sports is really about survival. and or at least that's my experience and observation, and that no matter how talented you are, if you look at this, you've got a lion being chased. You're being chased all the time. The question is how are you going to survive? What are you going to do to manage life on life's terms? What are you going to do to manage yourself in relationship to all of these factors that go on in your life? To review what we talked about, it's important, and I would say rule one is to understand the game. Understand the policies and the requirements and the history of the organizations that you work with. Secondly, it's important for you to understand the culture within that organization. How do you fit? How do people within that organization succeed? And to pay close attention to what the culture requires. Number three, it's very, very important for you to have your life in order with respect to managing those things that are most important to you. That's your family. That can also involve your coach. Coach can be a mentor in your life. But it's important for you to open the window and the door for that exchange. And as I've mentioned several times, the ability and the desire to have a reciprocal relationship where there's give and take. Finally, I just want to open it up to any questions that any of you may have in closing with respect to anything that we've talked about.
Talking specifically about the survival part and how sometimes the coach is a mentor. Some athletes, regardless of their age, come from like broken families, or maybe not necessarily broken, but families that or immediate household that's not supporting them, where their only support in the sport's really the coach. And with what's happening with COVID and furloughs and layoffs, I feel like there's going to be even more pressure on a coach and even less of a chance for there to be like a sports psychologist or someone else for the athlete to talk about. What are some recommendations you might have for an athlete struggling in that situation, and coaches alike?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. My thought about this, and I can tell you this is kind of what I've been doing. I've been having many, many conversations with players across the country on Zoom. I mean, it's changed the way that we do work. I work with a pro team on the West Coast, and so I can't go to the facility right now, but I certainly can make an effort to judiciously call each player. So for example, what I did is I went through the roster and I called, and then I, did workshops and this kind of thing to talk about dealing with anxiety and all of these things that are associated with the unknown. But from the standpoint of the player, again, and this is why I just want to reemphasize the importance for players to realize that they have resources. The first resource is themselves. Secondly, that the teams will offer that. And thirdly, that even though it's a vulnerable time, it's something that we're all experiencing. I mean, I tell my players right away, hey, look, man, I'm tired of walking in the circle of the development I live in, so this is not uncommon. And at the same time, let's just talk about it. Let's talk about what this means. Let's talk about the fact that you can't exercise in the way that you did before. And I think normalizing some of that is important, but also educating people about what is really going on with respect to the virus and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of uncertainty associated with it, but you raise a great, great question. And it's something that is unprecedented that I think we're all grappling with as coaches. Some of the coaches that I work with, I've been talking to them, and we don't usually talk about the stress that impacts coaches, but actually just before the virus, we had a large meeting to talk about managing our own stress. And I think it's important for coaches and general managers and even health professionals to acknowledge our own vulnerability during this time. Other questions?
I guess I've got one, and that is, what about the value of acknowledging your own vulnerability even not during these times?
Oh, absolutely. Ben, totally agree. I think that for helping professionals, coaches alike, it's important for us to realize where those vulnerabilities lie. Because anytime you're talking about behavioral change or impacting someone's life, you have to first start looking at yourselves. And I think that, as psychologists, therapists, and people that are in the helping professions, unfortunately, we don't spend as much time around this area because we're either addressing an issue or we believe that we're impervious to having difficulty that we could reveal, or that if we reveal it, it's going to make us more vulnerable to our clients or to our players. But I think that does a disservice in terms of the authenticity that many of the players that the young lady just mentioned, for example, are looking for. So they're looking for someone that's going to be real with them. They're looking for someone to say, hey man, I made a mistake. They're looking for someone that they can trust. And so part of that exchange has to do with, part of developing trust to me, it has to do with vulnerability. And it has to do first starting with, what are the things that cause me difficulty? I mean, to be frank, my son has been helping me with this PowerPoint the whole time because I don't want to screw it up, right?
Okay.
On Zoom. And, but I recognize that, and I recognize that's an area that I have to improve. Part of being human, I think, is being vulnerable. Part of being human, and particularly for those that are in quote unquote power, coaches or what have you, is to realize that your relationship extends beyond what you can do in terms of teaching the person how to hit the ball. And that players, and if you're really going to impact a player long term, I think you have to really do this work internally. You have to do that. And I've been, I mentioned that I've been very blessed for 25 years to do what I do. And to me, and I've had a lot of people say, well, how did you do this, or how have you been? And I think that that's just something that I knew intuitively, but it's something that I've worked on and continue to work on, is making sure that that is front and center. Because many of the players that I work with, they have keen cultural antennas, if you will. They have a keen sense of what is real and what isn't. And if you teach a player, and this is just my opinion, personal opinion, if you just stay on the street of, you need to throw the ball further, you need to, relax, or whatever, without establishing a relationship with that player, then I think you limit the opportunity for both of you to have a great working relationship. And I think you limit the player by not sharing your experiences.
And I guess those experiences can include some of your own vulnerability that you've experienced in your life.
Absolutely, no question. I mean, I'll be completely transparent. I will use illustrations because they can feel that from me. They feel that realness. I believe they do when I talk to them, and so that they don't feel alone. Many of the players that we work with, they feel alone. They may come to you, Ben, or come to you guys, because they don't have a safe zone. They don't have a safe environment. They have parents that, beyond this virus, that are struggling. We live in a life and time of uncertainty overall, and that permeates the living experience, the household experience of many of the folks that we work with. And that's why I mentioned the importance of the relationship between the player and his family, and you having some understanding of that relationship between family members and the player, because that will invariably show up on your court or on the field on Saturday or Sunday. So, any other questions? I love to hear from you. Any questions you may have, feel free to reach out. If I could be of help to anyone, I'd be more than happy to help or lend whatever knowledge or understanding of the game within the game. So I, again, appreciate the opportunity to join you this morning, and again, appreciate everyone participating and taking this time out. Hope you have a great day, and I hope everybody stays safe and sound.
Hey,
Thank you.
thank you.